The title of my presentation is Mainstreaming the Marxist Feminist Frame in the Context of Global Capitalism. The neoliberal economic project to aggressively further expand capitalism globally, buttressed with the neoliberal ideology and imperial design, has posed a challenge to the women's movement around the world. One challenge is that the nature and consequence of this neoliberal project undermines the goal of the women's movement to liberate women from oppression and exploitation through the transformation of gendered class systems. Alongside the global expansion of capitalism is the propagation of a neoliberal ideology that sanctifies even more the trickle-down theory, which has proven to be ineffective in eliminating poverty, while aggressively pushing for privatization that opens new spheres for capital around the world. Neoliberalism perpetuates the class inequality between women and gender and class inequality between men and women within the nation state. At the same time that it is increasing the inequalities between the North and the South, among nations within regions. These preconditions are necessary for the thriving of global capitalism. They are not merely inevitable outcomes. They are socially constructed as the necessary ground to root capitalism. Without the cheap labor of the working class and the super exploitation of women, global capitalism will collapse. This complex and formidable context invites a collective reflection of the dominant paradigms that shape thought and action in the politics of resistance of women's movements that operate both locally and transnationally. In this paper, I argue that a partial but important response to this challenge is to come up with paradigms of analysis and action that will capture the complex dynamics and consequences of this neoliberal project. One way to begin is to mainstream the Marxist feminist frame, take it back from the margins to the center as a framework of analysis and guide to shaping movements that liberate women from class and gender oppression and exploitation in the context of neoliberal project of global expansion of capitalism. This is not a new prescription, for there have been debates in the past that proposed the Marxist feminist frame. What might be somewhat new is the search for the art of resistance that help us identify the common ground on which we can bind packets of resistance here and there in order to confront transnationally head-on to change the course of this global neoliberal force. Why mainstream the Marxist feminist frame? Analysis of the context of global capitalism in which women, as well as men's, lives are enmeshed must precede collective transnational action of women's movements in order to locate what binds and divides women on a global scale. The Marxist feminist perspective has the potential as an analytical frame to be useful in making visible the threads that bind and divide women and divide men and women in the context of global capitalism buttressed by imperialism and militarism. The creation of these divisions plays an important role in the maintenance of global capitalism. That is why it is important to make them visible in order that a protracted struggle to tackle it from all fronts can be coordinated transnationally. Central in the premise of the Marxist feminist frame is to locate the position of women in the mode of production and relations of production and in the organization of social reproduction. Production and social reproduction are two sides of the same coin. The capitalist mode of production and the social relations that perpetually reproduce this mode is to be considered problematic and therefore a target for change. The analytical task of locating the position of women in the mode and relations of production is not merely so women can move up the capitalist ladder as implicit in the liberal feminist frame, but rather in order to examine, identify the intricate ways that the stratification of women and men in the capitalist mode of production maintains such system, with the ultimate goal of changing the system towards a non-capitalist alternative. How is women's labor super exploited in the capitalist mode and relations of production? Women's productive and social reproductive labor plays a central role in maintaining the capitalist system. When in the 70s, the Women in Development Perspective, oftentimes called WID or WID, that derived from the liberal feminist frame, promoted the idea that development must integrate women in the productive labor market without questioning the nature of development, actually was a way to make women participate more in maintaining the capitalist system. Women did not really get liberated from the capitalist system that contained the inherent contradiction of reproducing a cheap army of labor for profit maximization. What it did was to stratify the labor market based on gender by making women's labor cheaper than men's and creating a corporate hierarchy where men predominate the higher status of the corporate bureaucracy. The few middle-class women who may break the glass ceiling is a way to create the faulty myth that the capitalist corporate ladder is something women can aim for, thus rechanneling, neutralizing efforts to change and challenge the capitalist system. Meanwhile, class division between women in the capitalist mode of production is created and maintained, as majority of the women integrated into the capitalist relations of production were working class women who provide super cheap labor in the global assembly lines, from the garment sweatshops in New York to electronics and garment assembly lines in the Philippines, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mexico, etc. To maintain these global assembly lines, an ideology of consumerism and materialism among the middle class and wealthy men and women, especially in the North, bringing them into the commodity chains as consumers in the global consumption market. As more women get integrated into the capitalist labor market, new relations of reproductive labor ensued. I think it was mentioned earlier. The social reproduction of the next generation of workers is essential in the maintenance of the capitalist system, as it was necessary for the maintenance of slavery. In these new social relations of reproductive labor, a new class of super cheap and indispensable migrant domestic workers are created. The pattern of migration is mostly women from the poorer to richer countries, thus stratifying the global reproductive labor market based on class, nationality, ethnicity, gender, race, and even citizenship. The maintenance of this global reproductive labor force must not put stress on capital, so it must be largely privatized, placing the burden for wages mainly on families. And to be super cheap, it has to be a migrant worker from a third world country or a poor woman within a country. In fact, a new class of entrepreneurs has evolved in the trade of domestic labor. And I do a lot of detailed analysis of that in the book that I have published, Globalization, Labor Export, and Resistance, a study of Filipino migrant domestic workers in global cities. What then does mainstreaming Marxism feminism within this context in terms of directing the course of change mean? It means that the central goal of women's movements globally is to transform radically the capitalist mode of production and social reproduction, and think and create new systems of production and social reproduction where the goal is not simply to maximize profit that trickles up. The common ground for a global and transnational women's movement should be this: if global capitalism divides women and men, and it thrives on class and gender stratification, then what will bind globally and bind men and women transnationally is the struggle in challenging global capitalism and seeks non-capitalist relations of production and reproduction. Such women's movement must go beyond simply looking at greater women's labor force participation in the capitalist system as an indicator of women's liberation. It is a movement that rallies around working-class women's politics that transforms systems that are inherently exploitative of women's labor. Is there a women's movement that has embraced and still embrace the Marxist feminist frame? Yes. The Makibaka, the revolutionary movement in the Philippines, is an example. Central in the change agenda of Makibaka is the transformation of the feudal, semi-feudal, and capitalist modes and relations of production in the Philippines. Land to the tiller, to eliminate landlord system, coupled with communal relations of production, is central in its concept of economic development and politics of change. Makibaka participates in the broader national liberation movement of the Philippine Revolutionary Movement for self-determination in shaping the country's economic and political development that has been stunted by what it calls capitalist and imperialist globalization. Its concept of class locates women in the feudal and semi-feudal and capitalist relations of production in the Philippines, and therefore, in its view, the liberation of women is linked to the transformation of gendered class systems. In conclusion, the mainstreaming the Marxist feminist frame in the context of global capitalism, aggressively entrenched by neoliberal ideology and neoliberal practices and policies of global structures such as the transnational corporations and other superstructures like the IMF, the WTO, the NAFTA, the TPPA, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreements, will provide a counter-ideology and organizational practice to the neoliberal economic project. That is why this conference is important and historic moment in the world, the global women's movement. Change requires a repertoire of dialectics between the power holders of the status quo and those who are oppressed and exploited. The Marxist feminist frame can guide thought and action in shaping a global women's movement in the context of global capitalism. The beginning global women's movement, the IWA, the International Women's Alliance, has the potential of playing a significant role in this process. I am part of that movement. An alliance of women's movement organizations from countries in Europe, Middle East, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and North America was founded with leadership of Filipino women who are active and initiated and still continues to be active in the women's movement in spite the fact that militarism has tried to quench the movement. This was about 4 or 5 years ago in Montreal, Canada. One of the central issues it has included in its analysis of capitalist imperialism, a term I quote from their discourses in this founding conference. Thus, there are indications of the potential of the mainstreaming of Marxist feminist frame in a transnational women's movement to confront global capitalism frontally. We have to. Now is the time even more. While the task is long and arduous, and I am not being naive that there are no obstacles, these initiatives, including this conference, shows that hope is on the horizon. Our task is to embrace this hope, put it organizational action, and make it a global women's movement. I'm done. I gave you.